Hello, can you all hear me okay? It's good? All right. Well, thank you so much. We are the closing panel, and I know it's been a long day, so I'm very excited to moderate this panel on the value of open source software for federal programs. And I'm just going to keep this simple and brief in terms of having everyone give a little introduction. My name is Sophia Bilou. I work at the U.S. Geological Survey as an innovation specialist. Mostly I work on open science, or what I like to call participatory open science innovation. That includes crowdsourcing, citizen science, prize competitions, and I'd like to include that with open source because I think it's a really important area and very excited to have our experts here. So I'll just start along the line with Amanda.
Hello, my name is Amanda Bright. I'm a lead artificial intelligence data scientist, to get all the buzzwords there, into one title. I have been with NGA for 6 years. I specialize in developing workflows using automation to help increase efficiencies and help our mapping mission specifically.
Everyone speak into the mic. Go ahead.
Hello, I'm Chris Rasmussen. I'm the creator and founder of the Tearline program. You can actually look at this on your phone right now. It's an effort to create public-facing open source intelligence. It's built from an open source software stack. You can go to tearline.mil and check out the content. We have apps in both the Apple Store and Google Play. So and I've been in the open source intelligence space for about 20 years. That's my specialty. On the open source software side, I helped NGA launch its organizational brand account in GitHub in about 2013. And helped all of the processes from security, intellectual property, end to end to get those repositories to there. And I've stayed in the open source software advisory space. I'll talk to you a little bit more later about the improvements that we've made on the open source software side, but that's my background.
Hello, everyone. My name is Justin Rice. I work at NASA Goddard. I am the deputy manager of the ESDIS Science Systems Development Office. The ESDIS Project Office, ESDIS stands for the Earth Science Data and Information System Project Office. We manage 12 ground systems. We ingest, archive, distribute, process Earth science data. And we're one of the largest repositories of Earth science data in the world. Right now, we are in a massive push to get a lot of things transitioned over to the cloud. There's a lot of open software development across our many organizations, and I'll be happy to talk about that a bit more later. Thanks for having me.
Cool. My name is Rory. I work at the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, or USAID. You'll hear both. I'm a GIS analyst there and the activity manager for the Youth Mappers program and a open source evangelist.
Thank you all. So one of the first questions I want to ask you first too, I know you both are at NGA, but what are the main objectives with open source software? Is it to build community? What is the real value and benefits that you have seen based on your activities? Go ahead, Amanda.
So one of the main benefits that I've definitely gotten is, the community across NGA. We have a lot of missions and a lot of data scientists that are doing very different things, and one common language that we have is open source. I specifically, and many are like me, that I grew up learning data science through open source softwares and technologies. We've all tried different things to solve different problems, and so bringing everybody together it definitely brings a lot of camaraderie and a lot of problem solving and creativity.
So back to the founding of the GitHub brand account is the transparency is the key as far as the version control of something that's actually real and tangible. And particularly coming from an intelligence organization, doing that and doing it publicly, open source with a capital O, not internal, small o open source, but the big major licenses, doing it in public and doing it on the biggest stage possible, that helps with setting, I don't like this word, requirements. You can actually see what's going on in a fundamentally very clear way, rather than kind of esoteric business literature language and request for proposal type of language. You can see it in a very practical way. The other side of it as an intelligence organization is it helps kind of de-spookify intelligence. Is if you look at the open sourceization on the open source intelligence side of the commercialization of space, intelligence officers, patent researchers, Capital One researchers, and people that generate content, that kind of knowledge worker does very similar things. And we all kind of need the same type of business functions. So the open source software stuff for me really helped with helping the organization kick into a much more commercialized gear and get out of kind of the secret squirrel world. So it served a coding purpose, but it was also on the transparency part. Yeah, we all need to be here as knowledge workers, and this is just common sense type of stuff that we need, like Capital One needs, or just core, simple, vanilla stuff. And that was really, really helpful.
Do any of you like to also provide some ideas of what are the benefits of open source software?
I will take a step back and say, for us, it's more so building that community. Because out of the community emerges sharing, right? Sometimes we want to skip to sharing first, but if you don't have a community or people don't really know anything about it, it's useless. You can go to Google Play or Apple Store and see tons of free software. Who's using it and why, right? So a lot of times we get the people in the room, the players, the technical people, the software developers, the researchers, the managers, all in the room to develop that community, to develop that trust, to understand the use cases, to understand the business practices. We get everybody in the room and we build community. And part of building community is sometimes breaking down cultural barriers, right? The not built here mentality, right? We don't really know what it is. We know our people, we trust our developers. We know our systems and we know our needs, so we trust what we do better than we trust what the enterprise is doing, right? So getting all those people in the room and really working to break down those cultural barriers in a way that builds a larger community to share lessons learned, to share the different problems that we're dealing with. And then once you do that and you build trust, then you will see open source kind of take off. You don't have to really force it. It kind of just emerges as organically. I don't like those words. Organically, it emerges organically as a result of building that community brick by brick, and not like putting something on. Like, think of you trying to be a content provider on YouTube and just putting a video up on YouTube. Will it go viral? In these days, it's not likely, right? So you really have to work to build your community brick by brick. And then out of that emerges things like adoption of open source software and things like that.
And Rory, I know you use a lot of open source software with the youth mapper, so I'm not sure if you had any points that you
Yeah,
could add.
just riffing off what Justin was talking about, I kind of feel like working with open source is kind of like doing a company offsite, but way more fun. Instead of doing trust falls and icebreakers and stuff, you're working together with this common purpose, and you're bringing not just people in tech who are doing the coding, the programmers together, but project managers and users all together. And at USAID, we work with a wide swath of partners. We have implementing partners who are actually working on the projects that we design and run. We have the beneficiaries, the people who are benefiting from the projects we're running. And through open source as kind of a tool, not just to develop software, but to bring these people to that table in an organic way, like Justin was talking about, is really helpful.
Yeah, thank you for that. I remember when we were talking, you made some good points about access, especially in the developing communities. That's why sometimes it's really valuable to use that kind of software. So what I also want to ask, maybe start with you, Justin, is what strategies do you employ to encourage internal and external teams to use and contribute to open source software?
Okay, so like I mentioned before, we are an organization of about 600 people spread geographically across the United States. We have 12 data centers, if you will. And historically, those data centers have their own culture. They have their own mission. They didn't really work together as much. But now, as we're moving to the cloud, all the data will be in one place. Why aren't we working together? So we had to work with each one of the data centers to kind of break down cultural barriers. And we did this by taking developers from each one of the centers, if you will, and having them work together on the same team at the enterprise level. So I'm at ESDIS at the enterprise. We manage 12 different data centers, Each one of those data centers historically has their own mission, their own objectives, their own user community, their own developers. And we're saying now that we're moving to the cloud, we're going to take some of your developers from your center, and we're going to work together virtually, and create these virtual teams such that you all learn how to work together on hard problems. Because let's be honest, the easy problems have already been solved. So what we're beginning to see now that we have these cross-organizational teams is that it's slowly breaking down those barriers, right? It's like the not built here mentality is slowly eroding. And we begin to see people from different data centers volunteer more and more developers. How can we work together more? How can we bring in external organizations, right? One of the reasons why I'm here today is to help build community, to learn more about what's being done and to partner with other organizations, right? We don't want to do this in a vacuum. We don't want to keep rebuilding the same tools. We want to be able to solve those harder problems. And in order to do that, it takes all of us. It literally takes all of us to solve these problems at the scale we're trying to solve them these days. And so, getting back to the question, it's really working to understand that there are cultural barriers, there are management barriers, there are policy barriers, and working to kind of tear down these things constructively to let the people, let us, everyone know that, listen, we have to change how we've been working. It doesn't work. You hit a wall after a certain point, and that's what we've been doing, kind of cross-pollinating people at the enterprise, and people begin to form new teams and new organizations at the enterprise. So that's what we've been doing.
Yeah, you brought up some good points, because one of the things I wrote in my dissertation was looking at, I created an acronym because everyone loves acronyms, but STOP. So the sociocultural, the technological or technical, organizational, and the policy or politics barriers. And hopefully if we deal with those barriers, we can really do some serious innovation. But thank you for pointing out the various barriers that we need to look into. Rory, what are your thoughts on what strategies do you employ to encourage internal and external?
Yeah, first of all, Justin spot on with a lot of things, but I did find it a little funny that the NASA guy doesn't want to work in a vacuum. Isn't that kind of one of your big spaces? But no.
Not that vacuum.
No, I'm teasing. But yeah, I think to help promote open source within our agencies, you have to be that pushy salesman. That rep doesn't exist, right? And so you have to kind of take that on yourself, but also collaborate with others who have that same passion and interest within your agency and outside your agency. Developing use cases and user stories and success stories and prove that this has happened before. There's nothing better at USAID, where I work, than saying, this has already been done. This other program has already used it. It's been successful. So organizations like the government working group that Maggie mentioned at the first panel, their government working group has been really helpful with that, just connecting with others who've had those success stories and how they've done things. But it is a big challenge, right? I remember a colleague of mine had to write back in the day the whatever form it's called to have QGIS comply with the American with Disabilities Act. There's no one doing that. So trying to find resources and solutions to solve those kind of really technical problems is really important. And so being that pushy salesman, collaborating, and yeah, just finding those who are on the same page.
You know, you bring up a good point, because there's more and more DEIA, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility initiatives. And I wonder to what extent some of these software programs actually consider different pieces of that with the various kinds of disabilities that are out there. So having it open source maybe enables a little bit more of that possibility. I'm kind of curious. I don't know how much of these software do. I did want to, even though, because we still have a little bit of time, I wanted to ask both of you, since I know you're at NGA and the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, which tends to be on the intelligence community side and a little bit more internal among some things. So are there certain strategies that you guys employ in engaging with not only internal as well as external? Have there been challenges or tips and tricks that you've noticed in engaging with internal and external teams on open source?
So I can comment a little. We have been able to really encourage open source utilization when working with universities. So we have a lot of academic grants or participation in broader DoD programs where we're working, for a long period of time with college students on a real world problem. And so, they of course use open source software, which really encourages us to kind of be able to contribute back, to really have a full collaboration with these teams, because these students are incredibly creative and they really are able to push the boundaries and think outside the box. And, we as NGA get a lot out of these collaborations as much as they do.
As far as, I mentioned that I've been in the open source intelligence space, and there's, of course, cross-pollination between, kind of the flatness and transparency with open source software. But one of the things that was helpful to get people to not be afraid to put software into GitHub came from actually the intelligence side of the house with very practical rules. I ran an effort 5 years before COVID, 100% unclassified telework effort that did nothing classified. It was 100% unclassified, everything. And one of the challenges that we had historically, there had been jokes about it in the open source intel space for a long time, is the agency's interest in X is classified, and the X could have been anything. So I said, well, that's just not true, and everyone knew it wasn't true. So, but how do you come up with practical rules that people remember? People do not remember regulations. They remember stories. And there was 2 questions that came out of this effort called the Pathfinder that helps with, even on the open source software side. And if you look into the Tearline application that I mentioned earlier, you will see this philosophy practiced, to ask these 2 questions on whether it's safe or not. Does the group under study actively hide their behavior? Would they change it knowing that we're watching? And if the answer is no and no, you have a very safe question. So on the open source software side, when you want to contribute back or just put the repository out there, you have to ask, what is fundamentally are we protecting here? And the answer isn't everything because I work at NGA. You have to run it through a more calculus. Is there patentable level things that I should hold to my vest? Or is there truly a security thing that can be used to game the system in a real way? And those rules, and I'll get to the memo part that I wanted to talk about, of how that from the Intel side of the house informs safety to go out in a coding way. And it's all about what to protect and not to protect, and kind of the vanillaization of knowledge workers across the board, and to use that in a very practical, meaningful way.
So I know you kind of just started talking about it. So, one of the questions we had talked about was, why does contributing back to the open source communities help? And how can you do it effectively? So I know, and I had to do it, is actually print out the memo. Sorry, my phone was falling. But I wanted to print out this memo that I think it is amazing. So I will just name it Software Development and Open Source Software from the DoD. But I wanted to have you explain a little bit more of why, outside of the open source software and us using this and pushing our government software programs, where 20% of our programs should be open source based on the federal code policy, why is contributing very important as well?
Yeah, so that memo, the story back to the GitHub part, in 2013-14, it was how do we open source repositories within that brand so people can see all of the stuff that was under one brand account. Prior, you had NSA donating things to the certain software foundations. You had repositories that were hanging out there named after the repository, but the breakthrough there was under one brand, right? So that did well. And there's great software that's there. Our people that are the lead developers, Amanda has a repository there. She's interacting, taking the pull requests, and doing the interactive thing. The bigger question was, okay, cool. I feel safe in this branded NGA GitHub space. How do I go to contribute to repositories outside of that without talking to lawyers, talking to public affairs, and kind of that real gatekeeper mentality that people are afraid of? So this memo was drafted internal to the agency to say, again, these very practical questions. What are you protecting? Is it kind of, okay, yeah, that makes sense in 2022 that any organization would be using this kind of software. It's not that big of a deal. The memo basically said, you don't need to go to public affairs. You don't necessarily have to contact an attorney. Inform your supervisor, use common sense, And if it makes sense, go use your real name and ask the community to contribute back. And that was done. So when this DoD heard about this, they were working on this big policy memo from the entire DoD. They took that memo from NGA, and now it is available for all DoD employees. So you are not going to get in trouble by going out and interacting in a mission way, by using common sense and interacting with repositories. Now, this is very DoD, but I do think of a benefit even outside the DoD or IC culture. I think that gatekeeper public affairs mentality exists at a lot of federal agencies. So if you take a look at this memo on the contributing back part, you can say, hey, look, DoD has done this. Why can't we do this as well? So it's not just an esoteric DoD thing. And that was a big victory to do that. And it's a memo, and it has a seal and a signature, and it looks kind of, very DC, like this very cool building. But it's one of those hidden things that has so much empowerment that can not come across in a PDF file. But it was a big deal, and it's kind of a hidden gem, if you will.
And I probably will update the site with some of these resources because I think it's really great. But Amanda, do you have any thoughts on why contributing matters? Why is it so important for open source?
Sure. So, realizing contributing back is sometimes not possible. I think it's kind of our responsibility to do it when we can. And so I've actually, I have a repository on Chris's GitLab page. And, one of the things that I did was, I took the idea of the original SpaceNet metric, right, which was a metric to evaluate automatic feature extraction data. But in my reality, I don't have the luxury of, having a complete reference data set every time, because if I had that, I wouldn't be paying for automatic feature extraction. So I took that data, I took that concept, and I scaled it. I made it work. I took the same concepts, and I just kind of changed the ideas to make it work for what we do have. And I was able to share that back to the community. And it really increases transparency on, so that the community can then see what is important to NGA, how do we look at maps, how do we grade maps, so that way, we can start having a discussion on, is everything right, is everything wrong, and how can we do it better? And so I think that there's been a lot of benefit, and that was a time where, because of Chris's work, it was significantly more easy for me to do that and start those conversations.
So I don't know if Justin or Rory wants to point out anything further about building communities, but yeah, go ahead.
Just kind of responding to some of the things that NGO folks said, it's really awesome to see that you aren't working in that vacuum and leveraging documents and policies that are already out there from other agencies and learning from them and stuff. I think that doesn't happen enough in the federal government, nearly enough. And it's really interesting to hear about NGA's approach to this because, correct me if I'm wrong, but you guys are kind of the service organization to the rest of the intelligence community and broader federal government where you provide this geospatial analysis and lens to other folks. And so I would imagine open source would play a huge role in helping facilitate those connections a lot easier with all our siloed systems and proprietary software and different servers and yada, yada, yada. If things are operated in an open, kind of compatible way, it would just make your guys' job a lot easier as well. And that's probably an argument you can easily make to your supervisors.
Yes, and then there is on the, everyone knows the open source thing. It doesn't mean, free beer. There's a labor part that's very, very important. So you have a repository, and you'll go, okay, so what language do I have to code in? What skills do I need, particularly as the kind of the debate in open source software and machine learning and artificial intelligence. Okay, there's the repository. There's no way you can replicate it. So just because it's open source doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be able to replicate it if there's incredible compute resources. But there's the developer side, and that tends to be the technical audience. But it just helps, again, to that cultural piece of just the kind of the less spooky type of assumptions that really help with kind of the GitHub push to put it in a public way.
And, with the policy, there was something that recently from the Crowdsourced Instance Science side, there was a Crowdsourced Instance Science Act, and we've got this policy. However, these activities have been going on for a long time in some federal agencies. There weren't necessarily a need for there are existing authorities that allowed us to do that, but with these kinds of policies, do you feel like it has been really helpful I know in the federal government it can be a challenge if you don't have something from the top down that's saying it's okay. When there are folks that say, is it okay? Then it creates a challenge. And so have you found, this has been out for about a year, have you found that it's been really helpful in changing, cultural change is a challenge sometimes. And so I wondered if you've noticed any change.
So I'll use an anecdote from 40 minutes ago. I was talking to Amanda what I was going to talk about, and I told her about this memo. She's like, we can go do that? So it's kind of a sleepy thing that's not known, right? And there are some folks that, hey, is it a binding memo? It's like, okay, you're not going to get in trouble. It's just clear. You're not going to get in trouble to do it. And that's been the challenge, right? Even if you have the citation, well, okay, but what does my boss think? So there's these different layers that need to fall into place. But it definitely helps by having the big overarching document for sure. But again, these things have been going on and building up for a while, particularly with the commercialization of NG's, what historically was a classified space. So the commercialization of space, and then the issue, and then of course what's happening on the ground as well, it is just kind of ratcheted down the level of kind of behind the firewall mentality. So there's been a lot of progress. A good kind of measure is if you had someone that joined the organization in 1984, would they recognize the organization coming in 2022? And I think in many pockets, they would be very surprised on the level of things that are totally different than when, that's a good assumptions check, kind of like the time machine model to help how much things have changed. Still more to go, but I like to use I think that people would be, wow, I didn't know I can do all this, and didn't have to go ask permission for it.
Absolutely. Now, earlier you were kind of speaking of space, so I just want to go to you, Justin, from the NASA side. Have you found, I don't know if you're using more open source software versus contributing as well, and given that you're not in the intelligence community side with the NASA, from a NASA agency standpoint, do you find there's been issues, or have you ever thought about contributing back to the open source software community? Is there efforts to do that even within NASA?
Oh, absolutely. So we tend to leverage open source software to build applications that serve our end user community, right? And so these applications, we then open source, right? And so one thing, adoption is one thing of open source software, but then committing back to is a completely different thing, right? And each one of these has their own different challenges. When it comes to committing, who has resources, right? Sometimes it's training, right? We have this new cool widget, this new cool tool, but we may have to train your organization how to use it. Do we have resources for that? Does your organization have resources for that? Okay, if you actually use our application, are you just going to do a pull request and branch off from the main base to create your own? So there's a lot of layers to open source software and contributions. So internally, what we try to do within our organization is like I said, we have that federated team, and what we try to do there is we have the developers at the organization working together, and if their data center needs something, they have a different need, then that developer is more aware of what's going on with the enterprise, and before they build something, hey, you're going to use this open source software. You're going to contribute back to this instead of building your own. Now, when it comes to other organizations, for instance, we've partnered with NOAA, we have an MOU, and they are aware of all the things that we're doing. They say, hey, we like your common metadata repository. Can we use it? Like, yeah, we had to train you. And so we have to get that permission. We have to go to our managers and say, hey, we think it's a good value proposition to share this, but also train them how to actually use this, right? And then there's this other thing that kind of comes along with it, especially open source software. There's a lot of, is it documented well, right? When it's internal, like your developers know, like they know, they're further away from it because they've been working with it for so long. Is it well documented? Is it well tested? Is it well supported? These things are very key, especially when you're sharing things externally, right? To keep people from not only just being interested, but using it and using it long term to the point where they want to commit back to it, right? So those are all the things that we're kind of, the challenges that we're kind of tackling at this space. We still have a long ways to go, but I think we've come a long ways in really promoting open source software, getting out into the community, what we do and learning from other people. And if we can't collaborate, meaning that we can't, two different organizations have two different systems, it doesn't really work, the applications don't really work or transfer well. Well, how about this? How can we use open standards? How can we have our systems be interoperable? How about that? So we collaborate with OGC, we go to AGU and all these other conferences, talk to the users themselves. What do you need? We like to geek out on all the technical stuff for data systems, but what do you need? Because if we're building something that you don't want to use, then it doesn't really matter anyways, does it? And so all of those things that we're looking at this open source software from so many different angles and slowly making progress as time goes on.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good point. So we'll have maybe one last major question for all of you. I'll start with Rory. Does the use of open source software support other agency initiatives? So it's, open source comes up a lot in relation to maybe open data or other collaboration policies, more open, open government has been a major push for quite a few years or a decade now. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So at USAID, I think one way to look at it is our kind of core agency systems are largely proprietary, and means there's a lot of opportunity, I think, in the future to try to move into some more open source tools. Where we've really made a lot of progress with is in our programming, when we're using and developing tools in our projects. So we work in education, we work in conflict prevention, food security, healthcare, global health, things like that. And so those projects themselves, they're using amazing tools across the board and developing and contributing back to those tools. It's hard to collect all the stories that have been done. I find new ones every day, but that's where the real opportunity lies within our agency. And so it's supporting that as best we can. And also through open data as well, and making sure that the data we collect for our programming is made available to our implementing partners, as well as our development and humanitarian response partners as well.
Yeah, I definitely think there's been a lot of efforts that cross over based on some common policies in the open whatever space, open blank. So I don't know, from the NASA side, Justin, what have you thought of in terms of other initiatives that have been supported?
So right now, across the Science Mission Directorate, we have something called the Science Policy Directive 41, this SPD 41. And that's essentially saying that, NASA funds a lot of research. Well, if you are a NASA-funded researcher, then the expectation is that the data will be open, the software will be open, and the results of the science will be open as soon as possible, right? So open as possible, closed as necessary. And so we have a new initiative starting next year called Transform to Open Science that we're really marketing and getting out there. That's essentially to increase the awareness of open science and really promote the use of open science, and then broaden the participation to historically underrepresented communities, getting back to the DEIA initiatives, right? And so, again, open data, open science, and really building that community and sharing those results as soon as possible. Because as we know in the academic space, we tend to kind of hoard things together because of, a lot of things are associated with your secret sauce, right? And so we are trying to really to change that dynamic a little bit, change that narrative to the point where we're incentivizing you via funds to open this stuff up as soon as possible.
I'm really glad you brought that up because, there was a recent OSTP, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy memo that was put out just August 2022, so very recently, on ensuring free, immediate, and equitable access to federally funded research. So there's definitely been a big push for open science. There's a subcommittee for open science now. So very good point. That is definitely one of the major themes. Roy, you feel like you want to say something, so go ahead.
Yeah, so I don't think we have as a same level of like policy support for this, but one of the kind of mantras at USAID is do no harm. So in our international development work and our humanitarian response, that's baked into all of our programming. And it might take a little bit of education for contracting officers and project managers who don't have a technology background, but open source is a big part of that. USAID programs can last a couple of years, and then the funding and the activities will dry up. And so if you leave behind a proprietary database that no one can pay for, that data is good as dead. And so one thing that we try to do is to bake kind of these open platforms just because they'll be living long after where our programs have ended. And because of what we've talked about earlier, that sense of community where they can go out and get support readily available from that community around those different tools.
So I don't know if Chris or Amanda, you have any other thoughts based on what the other folks have shared in terms of, how does open source relate to other agency initiatives or policies that you want to comment before I give a final question for you all?
I can just give a quick plug. Doug wasn't able to make it earlier, but GNOME is the NSG Open Mapping Enclave, which is something NGA developed, and it's it's OSM schema data where anyone in the entire NSG can contribute or use the data for their missions, and so I think that's a really positive initiative that's really helped us contribute to other federal agencies' missions.
You mentioned open government, and you used the 10 years was the figure, and I was just thinking about the old, the Gov 2.0 days that kind of dovetailed with the Web 2.0 days, and it's been going on for a while. Two things, and again, I've been in this space for a while, and two kind of counterintuitive things that I've seen that I wanted to share from these type of open communities. One on the crowdsourcing side. So I've done prize competitions. We gave somebody in Iowa $10,000 for solving a technical problem. But what I have seen sometimes with some of these crowdsourcing efforts is kind of Hail Marys, a stump the chump, something that the organization really can't do, so they throw it to the outside expecting a miracle. You can't really put out what you can't reasonably do. So when you're crafting one of these things, it can't be a stump the chump activity or a Hail Mary. It's got to be reasonable when you're doing these crowdsourcing things, because I've seen some of the requirements when people are writing them, and it's like, can you fly to Neptune? I mean, it's like, if you can't do it, don't ask somebody else on the outside to do it for you.
I don't know, Justin, can we fly to Neptune?
We actually can fly to Neptune.
No, not. I meant more like a Superman way. No, but the other one that was kind of the counterintuitive, and I was a firm believer in this, and it's been kind of the opposite with the open data movement. I remember kind of consulting and working on the data.gov stuff when there was the idea that we were going to put this big repository of all this open data. And it was kind of a snooze fest in the sense that it attracts power users, people that can write code and know what an API is and can code against it. And I was kind of looking at, the report, the unstructured text report. That's going to go away. People are just going to consume data and visualizations and all this stuff. That's not happened. It's gone in the opposite direction. So if you look at trends in data journalism, the same assumptions were made. There's going to be these D3 libraries that are going to replace the newspaper article. There's no evidence to suggest that that's being traded off in any way. Right, so there's the power user, which is important, but they're not enough to make a community. So if you look at Tearline, the design of it leads with unstructured text. And at the bottom, there's these data sources that are the structured data. And my time with data.gov, kind of consulting with it, is I did rip off kind of the color codes that data.gov had to tell you what type of data type it was. That was really, really cool. So two things on the open government that I've seen that's kind of counterintuitive from my assumptions in 2009 coming into that Gov 2.0 community.
So as maybe a final question, because I know Eddie's going to really push me off stage very soon so he can speak, I wanted to ask you all, and there's maybe a twist I was thinking of asking. So what is a open source software that you really want people to know about, or that's your go-to? and/or that you've put on code.gov, because that is something that we all could do in the federal government that we're encouraged to do, at least 20% of our agency's policy or software. So I'll start with you, Rory.
Ooh, okay. My original answer was going to be QGIS, but everyone knows that these days. I think one of the lightning talks I saw earlier, in the code example, they used Postgres SQL, and they used OSM2 pSQL, which is an awesome little extension to just get OSM data into a database. And the queries are a lot more straightforward than like Overpass and stuff like that. And just, I think SQL is a great way, if you don't code, to get into starting to code a little bit.
GDAL is very popular in our community, and what we do is we wrap it around, we use our APIs to wrap it to kind of integrate with our systems. We have some more homebrew applications, open source software applications, such as a common metadata repository, meaning that this is what enables a scientist to search all our data holdings, right? The metadata repository. Then we have something called Cumulus, which is our cloud-based ingest and archive system. When they were on premises, everybody had their own ingest archive distribution system. Now it's one Cumulus, that's open source. We have a framework called Harmony, that is our framework for services. Thinking back to on premises, every data center had their own flavor of services, subsetting, reprojection, mosaicing services. Now we just have one platform called Harmony. All these things are open source. You know, come and talk to me afterwards if you want to learn more. Yeah.
I'm going to say Wagtail. Yeah, that's it's a content management open source. It's Python based, and that's what we use as the kind of the back to my point of the if you go to www.tairline.mil, that's what it's built in. That's part of the stack. Is that what you'll see is most people want 2 paragraphs and a pretty picture. That's what the vast majority of people will take. Again, you need the power users, but the elegance of the software, the documentation is good. The community is pretty strong. So it's been really, really helpful of riffing on from a content management perspective, from behind the firewall, from an authorization and authoring perspective, and then the outputs have been elegant.
So I use probably not the same repo twice. So my go-tos are relatively boring with things like GeoPandas, scikit-learn, Shapely. Those are my favorites. I've got a fan in the background. But lots of things have been fun. Things like Pix for GANs or sort of like GAN-flavored decision trees have been very interesting lately.
So I would say something that I've been using recently is Terria.js. So how many of you have heard of Terria.js? It's a geospatial catalog. So that's been fun to use. What I did want to do in my last couple minutes is, and I know I didn't really introduce this in the beginning, but you'll kind of notice that there's not 6 of us up here. We have one missing person. So Nate France, he would have loved to have been here, but he unfortunately got into a car accident not too long ago and suffered concussions. So he was not able to be here. But I really wanted to end our panel with a promo video of TAC.gov, which is a system that he's been strongly supporting. And I think it just might be a good way to end our session. And what I think he would say is, hey, come and use my open source software that we've helped develop. So TAC being, and this is maybe the cue to the folks if they are still able to play the video. If not, that's okay, but we'll just post it online. Let's see if we get some good high audio on this. Are you able to turn it up? Perfect.
The Tactical Assault Kit has been described as a game changer. As it's known outside of the DoD, the Team Awareness Kit is a movement that has seen the addition of 15 DoD programs and a growing base of over 250,000 users spanning the U.S. military, federal, state, and local government organizations, as well as U.S. partner nations. The technology and open source collaboration powering TAC permits real-time visibility into mission status, coordination of shared resources, and a reduction of fratricide incidents, all while operating on an open source platform to improve integration across civil use, government, and military users. Maintained by the team of dedicated professionals at the U.S. Army Combat Capabilities Development Command, C5ISR, and the TAC Product Center, TAC improves situational awareness across both small and large-scale command and control operations. The TAC solution is truly a fundamental shift from cumbersome radio-based operations, where observer azimuths, paper maps, and signal mirrors can delay reaction times. Improved communication and coordination are critical to saving lives. When seconds are the difference between life and death, TAC is your go-to platform. Come join the movement and see what TAC can do for your organization. Join the 250,000 members, 15-plus DoD programs, and countless first responders, police, and emergency personnel that have improved mission outcomes, reduced cost, and improved operational effectiveness by tapping into the open-source collaborative solution that is TAC. Learn about TAC from the experts in the field. Join the conversation about latest developments and best practices that will help you advance your organization to a well-connected, situationally aware, cost-effective, and mission-focused unit.
So if you didn't hear it, it was Tactical Assault Kit for the military side or Team Awareness Kit on the civilian side. So, but thank you so much.
I took a team awareness.
I'm hoping to maybe tap into that and do more of the metaverse open source version of it, because you could tell there was some virtual reality. So thank you so much. Thank you, panelists. And I want to welcome...